Thomas Mitchell had been riding for 3 days straight when he finally reached the small trading post in Socorro, New Mexico territory. The year was 1887, and the dusty frontier town was nothing more than a handful of wooden buildings scattered along a dirt road that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Bella, snorted and shook her head as they approached the weathered hitching post outside the land office. Thomas had come here with a specific purpose. At 28 years old, he had spent the better part of a decade working cattle drives across Texas and New Mexico, saving every penny he could scrape together. The dream that kept him going through long, cold nights under the stars and scorching days in the saddle was simple: to own his own piece of land. Not to work for someone else's brand, but to build something that belonged to him alone. The land agent, a thin man named Henderson with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger as Thomas entered the small office. Maps covered every wall, marked with red lines indicating property boundaries, and the air smelled of ink and old paper. "Help you, Cowboy?" Henderson asked, not bothering to look up from his paperwork. "Looking to buy some land," Thomas replied, removing his worn hat and running his fingers through his dark hair. "Heard you might have something available." Henderson finally raised his eyes, taking in Thomas's dusty clothes and weathered appearance. "Got any money?" Thomas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He counted out $50 in gold coins and silver pieces, placing them carefully on the desk. It represented years of careful saving, skipping meals, and sleeping under the open sky instead of paying for hotel rooms. The agent's eyebrows rose slightly. $50? That's not much in today's market, friend. Most decent parcels are going for considerably more. "It's what I have," Thomas said simply. "What can $50 buy me?" Henderson pushed his spectacles up his nose and pulled out a large map, spreading it across the desk. He pointed to an area marked in the northeastern part of the territory where the foothills began to rise toward the mountains. "There's this section here," he said, tapping the map with his finger. 160 acres. Good water source, some timber, decent grazing. Previous owner defaulted on his taxes. Thomas studied the map carefully. The location looked promising, situated in a valley with what appeared to be a creek running through it. "What's the catch?" Henderson shrugged. "Remote location. Nearest neighbor is probably 15 miles away. Been some Indian trouble in the area over the years, though things have been quiet lately. Most folks prefer to settle closer to town." The mention of Indian trouble didn't particularly concern Thomas. He had encountered various Native American tribes during his years on cattle drives, and had generally found that respect and common sense went a long way toward avoiding problems. He was more interested in the isolation, which meant peace and quiet to build his dreams. "I'll take it," he said, pushing the money across the desk. Henderson looked surprised. "Don't you want to see it first?" "I trust your description," Thomas replied, "and I don't have money to waste on travel just to look. Either it's suitable for raising cattle and building a life, or it isn't. I'll find out soon enough." The paperwork took the better part of an hour. Henderson filled out forms in triplicate, stamped documents with an official seal, and explained the boundaries and legal requirements. When it was finished, Thomas held the deed to his first real home in his calloused hands. He spent that night in Socorro's single boarding house, paying for his first real bed in months. Tomorrow he would begin the journey to his new property, but tonight he wanted to enjoy the luxury of a roof over his head and a hot meal that he didn't have to cook over a campfire. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Garcia, served him a dinner of beef stew and fresh bread. As he ate, she made conversation about the local area and the challenges of frontier life. "You buying the old Patterson place?" she asked when he mentioned his destination. "I suppose so, if that's what it was called." Mrs. Garcia shook her head. "That man never should have tried to homestead way out there. Too isolated, too wild. Place has been empty for near 2 years now." What happened to him?" "Oh, he didn't die or anything dramatic like that," she said with a wave of her hand. "Just gave up. Said the loneliness was eating him alive. Moved back east to live with his sister in Ohio. Some men aren't cut out for the frontier life." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. He had never minded solitude. In fact, after years of living in close quarters with other cowboys, constantly surrounded by the noise and chaos of cattle drives, the idea of peace and quiet appealed to him greatly. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Thomas loaded his few possessions onto a pack horse he had purchased, along with supplies for the journey and the first months of homesteading. His gear was simple but practical: basic tools for construction and farming, enough food to last several weeks, ammunition for his rifle and pistol, and a few personal items, including his father's old Bible. The ride to his new property took 2 full days. The landscape gradually changed as he rode northeast, transitioning from the flat desert plains around Socorro to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinon pine trees. The air grew cooler and cleaner as he gained elevation, and he began to see why someone might choose to settle in this area despite its isolation. On the afternoon of the second day, following Henderson's directions and using landmarks described in the property survey, Thomas crested a ridge and looked down into the valley that was now his home. His breath caught in his throat. The valley was more beautiful than he had dared to hope. A clear stream wound through the center, lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves shimmered gold in the autumn sunlight. The grass was still green despite the season, indicating good soil and reliable water. On the far side of the valley, he could see the remains of what must have been Patterson's homestead: a partially built cabin, a small corral, and what looked like the beginnings of a barn. Thomas guided Bella down the hillside, feeling a sense of contentment he hadn't experienced in years. This was exactly what he had envisioned during all those long nights on cattle drives. A place where a man could build something lasting, where the only sounds were wind through the trees and water over stones. As they approached the homestead site, however, something caught his attention. Thin wisps of smoke were rising from the area where the cabin stood. Thomas reined in his horse and sat quietly for several minutes, studying the scene below. The smoke was definitely coming from the cabin, or near it. Someone was there. His first thought was that squatters had moved in during the property's abandonment. This wasn't uncommon on the frontier, where empty buildings were often occupied by drifters, outlaws, or folks who had fallen on hard times. Thomas wasn't particularly worried about confronting whoever it was. He had legal ownership of the property, and most reasonable people would move on once that was explained. But as he rode closer, he began to notice details that didn't fit the typical squatter pattern. The area around the cabin had been cleaned up and improved. Someone had completed the roof that Patterson had left unfinished and had built what appeared to be a small garden plot near the stream. Firewood was neatly stacked against the cabin wall, and he could see that the corral had been repaired and reinforced. Thomas dismounted about 50 yards from the cabin and called out in a loud, clear voice. "Hello! Anyone there? I'm the new owner of this property, and I'd like to talk." For a long moment, there was no response. Then the cabin door opened slowly, and Thomas felt his assumptions crumble. 3 women emerged from the building. Even from a distance, he could tell they were Apache. They moved with the quiet grace he had learned to associate with Native Americans, and their clothing was a mixture of traditional and frontier styles. None of them appeared to be armed, but Thomas kept his hands well away from his weapons. The oldest of the 3, a woman who appeared to be in her 40s with gray streaking her black hair, stepped forward. She spoke in accented but clear English. "You are the new owner?" "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied, removing his hat respectfully. "Thomas Mitchell. I bought this land from the territorial government yesterday." The woman nodded slowly. "I am called Elena. These are my daughters, Maria and Luz." She gestured to the two younger women, who appeared to be in their 20s. "We have been living here for 1 year." Thomas found himself in an unexpected situation. He had prepared for many possible scenarios in homesteading, but discovering that Apache women were already living on his newly purchased land wasn't one of them. More puzzling was the fact that they had clearly been maintaining and improving the property. "I don't understand," he said honestly. "How did you come to be living here?" Elena was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "The man who was here before Patterson, he left quickly. He was afraid. We came here because we needed a place to stay, and the cabin was empty. We have made improvements, kept the land in good condition." Thomas looked around at the obvious care that had been taken with the property. The garden, the repaired buildings, the general sense of order and maintenance. These women had clearly been working hard to maintain the homestead. "Are you from the reservation?" he asked, trying to understand the situation better. Elena's expression became guarded. "We are Apache, but we do not live on the reservation. We have our reasons for being here." Thomas sensed that there was much more to the story, but he also recognized that pressing for details immediately would be inappropriate and potentially counterproductive. These women had clearly been living here peacefully and had been taking good care of his property. The immediate question was what to do next. He had legal ownership of the land, but the moral and practical situation was far more complex. He could demand that they leave, which was certainly his right. But that seemed both harsh and wasteful, given the obvious care they had taken with the place. On the other hand, he had invested everything he owned in this property and couldn't simply abandon his plans. "Would it be all right if I made camp nearby tonight?" he asked. "I've been traveling for 2 days and I'd like to rest before we figure out how to handle this situation." Elena looked surprised by his reasonable tone. "You may camp by the stream," she said after a moment. "There is good water and grass for your horses." As Thomas led his animals toward the stream, his mind was racing. This was definitely not how he had envisioned beginning his new life as a landowner. But as he looked back at the 3 women watching him from the cabin, he found himself curious rather than angry. There was clearly a story here, and Thomas had always been the type of man who preferred to understand a situation fully before making hasty decisions. He set up his simple camp under the cottonwoods by the stream, unsaddling his horses and letting them drink and graze. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and red, he built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and coffee. The aroma of cooking food seemed to carry across the valley, and after a while he saw Elena approaching his campfire. She moved quietly but not secretively, and Thomas rose respectfully as she approached. "Mr. Mitchell," she said formally, "I would like to speak with you about our situation." "Please, sit down," Thomas offered, gesturing to a log he had positioned near the fire. "I was hoping we could talk." Elena settled herself gracefully and accepted a cup of coffee when he offered it. For several minutes they sat in companionable silence, watching the fire and listening to the sound of water flowing over stones in the stream. "You are not what I expected," Elena said finally. "How do you mean?" "Most white men would have ordered us to leave immediately. Some would have used threats or violence." Thomas considered this. "I don't see any point in threats or violence. You've been taking better care of my land than I could have managed from Texas. Besides, I've got questions about how you came to be here, and threatening folks isn't usually the best way to get honest answers." Elena studied his face in the firelight. "You are different from the other man, Patterson." He was afraid of everything: sounds in the night, shadows that moved in the forest, the idea that Apache might be nearby. Fear made him weak and foolish. What kind of sounds and shadows? Thomas asked, genuinely curious. For the first time, Elena smiled slightly. Mostly normal sounds. Animals, wind, the settling of wood in the cabin. But Patterson had convinced himself that hostile Indians were constantly watching him, planning to attack. He jumped at every noise and barely slept. After 6 months, he was talking to himself and seeing threats that weren't there. Thomas nodded. He had known men who cracked under the pressure of frontier life. Usually those who came west with romantic notions about adventure, but no real understanding of the challenges and isolation involved. So when he left, "You moved in?" "Not immediately," Elena said. "We watched the place for several weeks to make sure he was truly gone and not coming back. When we were certain the cabin was abandoned, we decided it would be a good place for us to stay." "Where were you living before?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Thomas waited patiently, sensing that this was a sensitive topic. "My husband was a scout for the army," she said finally. "He worked with soldiers, helping them understand the land and the people. When he was killed in a conflict with other Apache who saw him as a traitor, we were no longer welcome in his tribe, but we also could not safely live among white settlements because of our race." Thomas felt a weight of understanding settle over him. These women were caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. In the complex and often violent relations between Native Americans and white settlers, people like Elena's family found themselves in an impossible position. "That must have been very difficult," he said simply. "We survived," Elena replied matter-of-factly. "We found this place and it has been good for us. We grow food, maintain the buildings, and live quietly. We bother no one, and no one bothers us." Thomas stared into the fire, thinking. The practical part of him knew that he should ask these women to leave. He had bought this land to start his own homestead, to build his own life. Having 3 Apache women living on the property would complicate everything from a legal, social, and practical standpoint. But another part of him recognized that these women had found a refuge here, a place where they could live in peace after losing their home and family. They had clearly been working hard to maintain and improve the property, and if they left, where would they go? The reservations were often harsh and unwelcoming to those who hadn't originally come from that particular tribal group, and white settlements would be equally unwelcoming to Apache women on their own. "Elena," he said slowly, "I need to think about this situation. I've invested everything I own in this land, and I came here to build a new life, but I can see that you and your daughters have also built something here. I don't want to make any hasty decisions that I might regret." Elena nodded. "That is wise. Hasty decisions often lead to trouble. Would it be all right if I stayed here for a few days while I figure out the best way to handle this? I promise I won't interfere with your daily routine, and I won't make any demands until I've had time to think everything through." "That would be acceptable," Elena agreed. "Tomorrow, if you wish, I will show you the improvements we have made to the property. Perhaps that will help you understand our situation better." As Elena rose to return to the cabin, Thomas found himself watching her with a new respect. This was clearly a woman who had faced tremendous challenges and had found ways to survive and even thrive. Her daughters, too, had managed to create a life for themselves in difficult circumstances. For the first time since discovering that his new property was already occupied, Thomas began to wonder if there might be a solution that could work for everyone involved. It would require careful thought and probably some compromise from all parties, but perhaps this unexpected situation didn't have to be a disaster. As he banked his fire for the night and rolled out his bedroll under the stars, Thomas Mitchell found himself facing the first major decision of his life as a landowner. It was far more complex than he had anticipated, but somehow that didn't discourage him. If anything, it made the challenge more interesting. The sound of the stream flowing over stones provided a peaceful backdrop as he drifted off to sleep, already beginning to formulate ideas for how this unexpected situation might be resolved. Thomas woke before dawn to the sound of movement near the cabin. He lay still in his bedroll, listening as quiet footsteps moved around the homestead. Soon he smelled the smoke of a cooking fire and heard the soft murmur of voices speaking in what he assumed was Apache. As the sky began to lighten, revealing the mountain peaks surrounding the valley, Thomas rose and went about his morning routine. He watered his horses, washed in the cold stream, and was building up his own fire when Elena approached. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she said formally. "Would you like to join us for breakfast? We have plenty of food." Thomas was touched by the offer, especially considering the uncertain nature of their situation. "That's very kind, but I don't want to impose on your supplies." "It is not an imposition," Elena replied. "Hospitality is important, even in difficult circumstances." Thomas followed her to the cabin, where he got his first good look at the improvements the women had made. The building had been expanded slightly with a lean-to addition that served as both storage and workspace. The roof was now completely weatherproofed, and someone had chinked the gaps between the logs with mud and moss to keep out drafts. Inside, the cabin was remarkably comfortable. The women had created a functional living space with handmade furniture, woven mats on the floor, and shelves lined with preserved foods and household items. A large stone fireplace provided both heat and cooking space, and the whole interior had a sense of permanence and care that impressed Thomas. Elena's daughters, Maria and Luz, greeted him politely but remained somewhat reserved. Maria appeared to be the older of the two, perhaps 25, with intelligent dark eyes and skilled hands that moved efficiently as she helped prepare the meal. Luz was younger, probably early 20s, with a quick smile that she tried to hide behind a serious expression. The breakfast consisted of cornmeal cakes, eggs from chickens Thomas hadn't noticed the previous evening, and coffee that was considerably better than his usual trail brew. As they ate, Elena began to explain the work they had done on the property. "When we arrived, the cabin roof leaked badly," she said. "We spent the first weeks making it weatherproof. Then we enlarged the garden and built the chicken coop." "Where did you get the chickens?" Thomas asked. Maria spoke for the first time. "We traded for them at a settlement 2 days' ride from here. We had items to trade that we brought from our previous home." "What kind of items?" "My wife was skilled at beadwork and weaving," Elena explained. "She taught our daughters. We trade our crafts for things we need." Thomas was beginning to understand how these women had not only survived, but actually improved their situation. They had practical skills, intelligence, and the determination to make the best of difficult circumstances. After breakfast, Elena offered to show him around the property, and Thomas accepted eagerly. As they walked, she pointed out the various improvements and explained her thinking behind each one. "We moved the chicken coop here because it gets morning sun but is protected from the afternoon heat," she said, indicating a small but well-built structure. "And we planted the garden in this location because the soil drains well but stays moist from the stream." The garden was impressive. Even in late autumn, Thomas could see evidence of a productive growing season. Cornstalks stood in neat rows, and there were signs that beans, squash, and other vegetables had been successfully cultivated. A small root cellar had been dug nearby for food storage. "You've done more in 1 year than Patterson apparently accomplished in 6 months," Thomas observed. "Patterson was not a practical man," Luz said with a slight smile. "He wanted to be a farmer, but did not like to work with his hands. He spent more time talking about what he would do than actually doing it." As they continued the tour, Thomas noticed other improvements. The corral had been not only repaired but expanded, with a small shelter for animals during bad weather. Someone had built a smokehouse for preserving meat, and there was a workshop area where tools were neatly organized. "You've essentially built a functioning homestead here," Thomas said. "This represents a tremendous amount of work." We needed a home, Elena said simply. When you need something, you work for it. Thomas was beginning to realize the full complexity of his situation. These women hadn't just been squatting on his land, they had been building a life here. They had invested significant time, effort, and resources in improving the property. From a purely practical standpoint, evicting them would mean losing all of these improvements and starting over from scratch. But beyond the practical considerations, Thomas found himself genuinely impressed by what they had accomplished. These were clearly capable, hard-working people who had made the best of a difficult situation. They had shown more initiative and success than the previous owner, despite having no legal claim to the land. "Elena," he said as they completed the circuit and returned toward the cabin, "I have to ask you something directly. What did you think would happen when the real owner eventually showed up?" Elena stopped walking and turned to face him. "We knew someone would come eventually. We hoped that person would be reasonable, that they would see what we have built here and understand that we are not here to cause trouble. And if they weren't reasonable, then we would have to leave and find somewhere else," she said matter-of-factly. "We have done it before. We are not helpless, Mr. Mitchell. We can survive. But this place has been good for us, and we have been good for it." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I can see that. The question is, what do we do now?" That afternoon, Thomas spent time working on his own gear and thinking about the situation. As he repaired a piece of tack for his horse, he watched the women go about their daily routine. Maria tended the chickens and gathered eggs, while Luce worked in the garden, preparing beds for winter. Elena was at the workshop, crafting something with wood and leather that looked like it might be a harness or bridle. The scene was peaceful and productive. These women had created a life of quiet competence in this remote valley. They bothered no one, supported themselves through their own work, and had actually improved the property significantly. In many ways, they were ideal neighbors for someone wanting to live a quiet homesteading life. But Thomas also had to consider the realities of frontier society. Having Apache women living on his property would certainly raise questions and possibly create problems with neighbors, territorial authorities, or other settlers. While Thomas personally didn't share the widespread prejudices against Native Americans that were common among many whites on the frontier, he knew that others might not be so accepting. As evening approached, Elena came over to where Thomas was working. "Mr. Mitchell, may I speak with you?" "Of course." She settled herself on a nearby log, her expression serious. "I want to be completely honest with you about our situation. Perhaps if you understand everything, you can make a good decision." Thomas set aside his work and gave her his full attention. "When my husband was killed," Elena began, "it was not in battle with white soldiers. He was killed by other Apache who believed he had betrayed his people by working with the army. They said he had forgotten his blood, forgotten who he was." She paused, staring out across the valley. "My husband believed that cooperation was better than constant war. He thought that if Apache could work with whites, both groups might benefit. Many of our people disagreed. They saw his work as betrayal." "What did you think?" Thomas asked quietly. "I thought my husband was a good man who was trying to find a way for our children to have a future," Elena replied. "But after his death, his enemies made it clear that we were not welcome among our people. They said we were contaminated by white ways, that we could not be trusted." She looked directly at Thomas. "So we left. We tried living near the fort where my husband had worked. But the soldiers' families did not want Apache women nearby, even ones who had helped them. We were caught between two worlds, belonging to neither." Thomas was beginning to understand the full tragedy of their situation. Elena and her daughters had lost not just a husband and father, but their entire community and identity. They were refugees in their own land. "We heard about this place from another scout," Elena continued. He told us about a settler who had abandoned his claim and left buildings behind. We came here hoping to find temporary shelter while we decided what to do next. But this valley became home to us. What would you do if you had to leave? Thomas asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment. I do not know, she admitted. There are few places for women in our situation. We are too Indian for white settlements and too white for Indian communities. We might try to reach California or Mexico, where people are less concerned about such things. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His decision wouldn't just determine whether he could build his dream homestead. It would determine the future of 3 women who had already lost everything once. That evening, after another shared meal, Thomas sat by his campfire and tried to work through his options. He could ask the women to leave, which was certainly his legal right. He could try to work out some kind of arrangement where they stayed temporarily while looking for another place to live. Or he could consider some more permanent solution that allowed them to remain. The first option felt harsh and impractical. The second was just postponing the inevitable and would probably end up being unfair to everyone involved. The third option was risky and unconventional, but it was also the one that made the most sense from both a human and practical standpoint. As he pondered the situation, Luce approached his fire. Mr. Mitchell, may I ask you something? Sure. She settled herself nearby, her expression thoughtful. Why did you come here? To this remote place, I mean. You seem like a man who could find work anywhere. Thomas stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the dark sky. I've been working for other people my whole life, he said, following their orders, building their dreams, making them money. I wanted to build something of my own, something that would last. What kind of something? A cattle ranch, eventually. Nothing huge, just big enough to support a family and provide a good life. This valley would be perfect for it. Good water, decent grazing, far enough from settlements to have peace and quiet. Luce nodded. That is a good dream. Do you have a family? Not yet, Thomas admitted. I figured I'd build the homestead first, get established, and then maybe find a wife and start a family. My father had similar dreams, Luce said quietly. He wanted to bridge the gap between Apache and whites, to find a way for both peoples to share the land and live in peace. He thought if he showed white soldiers how to understand Apache ways, and if he helped our people understand white ways, maybe the fighting would stop. That sounds like a good dream, too. Yes, but dreams can be dangerous when other people do not share them. Thomas looked at the young woman in the firelight, struck by her wisdom. What do you dream of, Luce? She smiled sadly. I dream of a place where people like us can live without having to choose sides, where we can be both Apache and American, where we are judged by our actions rather than our blood. Thomas stared into the fire, thinking about her words. In many ways, the situation they all faced was a microcosm of the larger conflicts and challenges of frontier life. Different peoples trying to find ways to coexist, to build new lives in a harsh and sometimes unforgiving land. Luce, he said slowly, what would you think of a partnership? She looked confused. What kind of partnership? Your family has already proven you can maintain and improve this property. You have skills I don't have, and you've already invested a year of hard work here. I have legal ownership and experience with cattle ranching. What if we worked together instead of competing for the same land? Luce's eyes widened. What do you mean exactly? Thomas was thinking out loud now, the ideas forming as he spoke. What if your family continued to live here and maintain the homestead while I developed the cattle operation? We could be partners. You provide the daily management and improvements you've already been doing, and I provide the legal ownership and livestock expertise. That is an unusual idea, Luce said carefully. Most good ideas are unusual, Thomas replied. The question is whether it would work for everyone involved. Luce was quiet for several minutes, obviously thinking through the implications. "It would solve many problems," she said finally, "but it would also create new ones. What would people say about a white man partnering with Apache women? What would happen if the territorial government objected?" Thomas had been wondering the same things. "I suppose we'd have to deal with those problems as they came up. But Luce, I've learned that people can object to just about anything if they set their minds to it. Sometimes you have to do what's right and let the objections take care of themselves. You would trust us to be your partners? Even though we are Apache?" "I'd trust people who've already proven they can take care of this land and work hard to improve it," Thomas said. "Race doesn't have much to do with character, in my experience." Luz stood up, her expression thoughtful. "I should talk to my mother and sister about this. It is not a decision I can make alone. Of course, take whatever time you need." As she walked back toward the cabin, Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The idea of a partnership had emerged from their conversation, but now that he'd voiced it, he realized it felt right in a way that the other options hadn't. He spent the next hour thinking through the practical aspects of such an arrangement. The women had already proven they could manage the day-to-day operations of the homestead. Their improvements had increased the property's value significantly, and their willingness to work hard and maintain high standards was exactly what a cattle operation would need. From their perspective, a partnership would provide security, legal protection, and a permanent home. They would no longer have to worry about being driven away or having to start over again somewhere else. Of course, there would be challenges. Frontier society was not always accepting of unconventional arrangements, especially ones that crossed racial lines. There could be legal complications, social disapproval, or even hostility from neighbors or territorial authorities. But as Thomas sat by his dying fire, looking up at the stars scattered across the clear mountain sky, he found himself thinking that some things were worth taking risks for. These women had already taken tremendous risks just to survive. They had lost their home, their community, and their security, yet they had managed to build something new and valuable from nothing. The next morning, Elena approached him as he was preparing his coffee. "Mr. Mitchell, my daughters told me about your conversation last night, about a possible partnership." "Yes," Thomas said, offering her a cup of coffee. "I hope I didn't overstep by discussing it with Luce before talking to you." "Not at all. Ideas should be discussed. But I want to make sure we understand each other clearly. You would be willing to share ownership of this land with Apache women?" Thomas considered his words carefully. "I would be willing to share the work and the benefits of this land with capable partners, regardless of their race. What matters to me is character, work ethic, and the ability to contribute to our mutual success." Elena nodded slowly. "And what would this partnership look like in practical terms?" "That's something we'd need to work out together," Thomas replied. "But I imagine you and your daughters would continue doing what you've been doing, maintaining the homestead, managing the garden and livestock, keeping up the buildings and improvements. I would handle the legal aspects, provide capital for expansion, and manage any cattle operation we might develop." "And the profits? The ownership?" Thomas had been thinking about this question half the night. "I think we'd need to work out a fair division based on everyone's contributions. You've already invested a year of hard work and significant improvements. I'm bringing legal ownership and capital. Any future profits should be shared in a way that reflects everyone's contributions." Elena was quiet for several minutes, obviously weighing the proposal carefully. "It is a generous offer," she said finally. "More generous than we had any right to expect." "It's not generosity," Thomas said honestly. "It's good business. You've already proven you can make this place successful. I'd be foolish to start over from scratch when I could build on what you've already accomplished." Maria approached them, carrying a basket of eggs from the morning collection. "Mother, may I speak?" "Of course." Maria looked directly at Thomas. "Mr. Mitchell, Why should we trust you? You seem like a good man, but we have learned that good intentions do not always lead to good outcomes. What guarantee do we have that you will honor such an agreement? It was a fair question, and Thomas respected her directness. You don't have any guarantee, he admitted. Just as I don't have any guarantee that you won't decide to leave or that this arrangement will work out for any of us. Trust has to be earned over time. But you are willing to risk it? I think the potential benefits outweigh the risks for everyone involved. You get security and a permanent home. I get experienced partners who have already proven they can make this place successful. Together, we might be able to build something better than any of us could manage alone. Maria nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. But there is another question. What happens if neighbors or authorities object to our arrangement? What if they try to force us to leave? Thomas had been expecting this question. Then we deal with those problems together, as partners. I'm not naive enough to think there won't be challenges, but I believe that united we'll be stronger than any of us would be alone. Elena stood up, her expression resolute. Mr. Mitchell, I would like to propose that we try this partnership for 1 year. If at the end of that time any of us feels it is not working, we will reconsider the arrangement. Does that seem reasonable? Thomas extended his hand to her. That seems very reasonable. As Elena shook his hand, Thomas felt that he was beginning something entirely different from what he had planned when he rode into this valley 3 days ago. But as he looked around at the thriving homestead, the beautiful valley, and the 3 capable women who had built a life here against all odds, he felt that this unexpected turn of events might lead to something far better than his original dreams. The sun was climbing higher, promising another beautiful autumn day in their shared valley. For the first time since arriving, Thomas felt that he was truly home. The first winter of their partnership tested everyone's resolve and ingenuity. Thomas had spent enough time on the frontier to know that mountain winters could be harsh, but the reality of keeping a homestead running through months of snow and freezing temperatures was different from simply surviving on cattle drives. Elena and her daughters proved invaluable during those cold months. They had spent the previous winter learning the particular challenges of their valley and had prepared accordingly. The root cellar they had built was stocked with preserved vegetables, dried meat, and other supplies. They had also learned which areas of the property provided the best shelter for animals during storms. Thomas contributed his own skills to their winter preparations. He built additional shelter for the small herd of cattle he had purchased that autumn, and his experience reading weather patterns helped them anticipate and prepare for the worst storms. Together, they developed systems for caring for the animals, maintaining the buildings, and keeping everyone fed and warm through the harshest months. But the winter also brought their first real test from the outside world. In January, 3 territorial marshals arrived unannounced, following reports that Apache were living illegally on Homestead property. The men were cold, suspicious, and clearly expecting trouble. Thomas met them at the valley entrance, well away from the cabin. He was polite but firm in explaining that the women were his legal partners in a legitimate business arrangement. The marshals were skeptical and demanded to see documentation. Mr. Mitchell, said the lead marshal, a heavy-set man named Crawford, we've had reports that you're harboring hostile Indians on your property. That's a serious matter in these parts. Thomas kept his voice calm and reasonable. Marshal Crawford, there are no hostile Indians on my property. I have 3 business partners who happen to be Apache women. They're helping me develop a cattle operation, and they've proven to be excellent workers and managers. Business partners? Crawford's tone was incredulous. Indians can't be legal partners in a white man's business. That's just not how things work. With respect, Marshal, I've checked with a lawyer in Socorro, and there's nothing in territorial law that prevents such an arrangement, Thomas replied. This was true. He had made the long trip to town the previous month specifically to research the legal aspects of their partnership. The marshals insisted on inspecting the property and interviewing Elena and her daughters. Thomas had no choice but to agree, though he made it clear that any rudeness or threats would not be tolerated. Elena handled the interrogation with dignity and intelligence, answering all questions directly and honestly. She explained their situation, their work on the property, and their peaceful intentions. Maria and Luz were equally composed, demonstrating their knowledge of the homestead operations and their contributions to its success. After several hours of investigation, the marshals found nothing illegal or threatening about the arrangement. The women were clearly not hostile, the property was well managed and productive, and there was no evidence of any wrongdoing. "This is highly irregular, Mitchell," Crawford said as they prepared to leave. "You might want to reconsider this arrangement before it causes you serious problems." "What kind of problems?" Thomas asked. "The kind where neighbors start wondering if they can trust you to side with your own people when trouble comes." After the marshals left, Thomas found Elena sitting by the stream, staring thoughtfully at the water flowing under a thin layer of ice. "Are you worried about what that man said?" she asked, without looking up. Thomas settled beside her on the log they had positioned there for quiet conversations. "About neighbors not trusting me? Not particularly. I've never had many neighbors anyway. But it could become a problem for you. People might stop doing business with you, or worse." Thomas picked up a small stone and tossed it into the stream, watching the ripples spread across the surface. "Elena, do you remember what I told you that first night? About wanting to build something that would last?" "Yes." "I've been thinking about that. See, most things folks build out here don't last very long. Towns boom and bust, ranches succeed and fail, people come and go. But the things that do last, they're usually built on something solid, something more than just profit or convenience." Elena looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this partnership isn't just good business, though it is that. It's also the right thing to do. And in my experience, things built on doing right tend to last longer than things built on doing what's easy or popular." Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Thomas traveled to Texas to purchase a larger herd of cattle using savings he had accumulated over his years as a cowboy. The investment represented nearly everything he owned beyond his share of the homestead, but the grassland in their valley could support a much larger operation than the few head they currently ran. While he was away, Elena and her daughters faced their own test. A group of drifters camped near the valley entrance and began making increasingly bold visits to the homestead. They claimed to be heading to California gold fields, but they showed more interest in the women and the obvious prosperity of the ranch than in continuing their journey. When Thomas returned with 40 head of cattle and 2 hired cowboys to help drive them, he found Maria standing guard at the homestead with a rifle while Elena and Luz worked to secure the animals and valuables. "What's the situation?" Thomas asked immediately. Maria quickly explained about the drifters, their threatening behavior, and their refusal to move on despite being asked repeatedly to leave the area. Thomas's first instinct was to ride directly to their camp and order them to leave, but Elena suggested a more strategic approach. "These men are testing us," she said. "They want to see if we are strong enough to defend what we have built. If we handle this correctly, word will spread that this is not an easy place to cause trouble." Together, they developed a plan. Thomas and the 2 cowboys, both experienced men named Jim and Carlos, who had worked with Thomas on previous drives, would approach the drifters' camp openly and deliver a clear message. Elena and her daughters would position themselves strategically around the homestead, armed and ready to respond if the situation escalated. The confrontation, when it came, was anticlimactic. Faced with three armed and determined men who clearly knew how to handle themselves, and with the obvious signs of a well-defended homestead behind them, the drifters decided that easier targets could be found elsewhere. They left within hours, grumbling but not willing to test their luck further. "That was well handled," Carlos observed as they watched the drifters disappear over the ridge. "Those women know how to take care of themselves." Jim nodded in agreement. "I've seen plenty of homesteads that couldn't have managed a situation like that. You've got good partners here, Thomas." The cattle operation flourished throughout the spring and summer. The valley's grass was even better than Thomas had hoped, and the reliable water source meant they could support a larger herd than most comparable properties. Elena's daughters proved to have natural ability with horses and cattle, and their skills improved rapidly under Thomas's tutelage. More importantly, the partnership itself was working well. Each person contributed their unique skills and knowledge, and they had developed effective systems for making decisions and resolving disagreements. Thomas handled the business and legal aspects of the operation, while Elena managed the day-to-day running of the homestead. Maria became their expert on cattle management, and Luz proved to have a talent for breeding and training horses. The first real test of their financial arrangement came that fall when they sold their first herd. After accounting for expenses and setting aside money for winter supplies and next year's operations, they had a substantial profit to divide. Thomas suggested they split the profits equally among all four partners, regardless of their different initial contributions. "We're all working equally hard now," he argued, "and we're all taking equal risks." Elena objected, pointing out that Thomas had provided both the legal ownership and the capital for purchasing the cattle. "You should receive a larger share to reflect your greater investment." They spent several evenings discussing the matter, and eventually reached a compromise that satisfied everyone. Thomas would receive a slightly larger share to reflect his ownership and capital investment, but the difference would be modest. More importantly, they established a system where future profits would be shared equally as they all became more equal partners in the growing operation. But success brought new challenges. As word spread about the thriving ranch in the mountain valley, they began to attract attention from people who wanted to either join their operation or buy them out. Several offers came from businessmen in Socorro and Santa Fe who were interested in purchasing the property for development. More troubling were the visits from territorial officials who seemed suspicious of their unconventional partnership. Twice that second year, government agents arrived asking questions about their business arrangement, their relationships with local tribes, and their loyalty to territorial authority. Thomas handled these visits with a combination of patience, legal knowledge, and quiet firmness. He had documentation for everything they did, and he consistently emphasized the legitimate and productive nature of their operation. More than once, he had to remind officials that they were violating no laws and were contributing to the economic development of the territory. "Mr. Mitchell," said one particularly persistent official, "surely you understand that this arrangement raises questions about where your loyalties lie. These are Indian women. How can the territorial government be sure they're not passing information to hostile tribes?" Thomas looked the man directly in the eye. "Sir, these women haven't had contact with any Apache bands for over 3 years. Their loyalty is to this homestead and this partnership. If you're concerned about territorial security, you should be supporting successful, peaceful arrangements like ours rather than trying to undermine them." The third year brought both personal and professional growth for all the partners. Thomas had become not just a business partner, but a trusted friend and protector. Elena had grown more confident in dealing with white society, and her knowledge of both Apache and frontier skills made her invaluable in running their increasingly complex operation. Maria had developed into an excellent cattle manager and had begun breeding horses as a side business. Her natural ability with animals, combined with training from Thomas, made her one of the most skilled ranch hands in the region, regardless of gender or race. Luce had surprised everyone, including herself, by showing a talent for business and organization. She kept meticulous records, handled correspondence with buyers and suppliers, and had developed an extensive network of trading relationships that benefited their entire operation. That summer brought a visitor who would change their lives in an unexpected way. Dr. Jonathan Wright, a physician and writer from Boston, was traveling through the territories gathering material for a book about frontier life. He had heard about their unique partnership and requested permission to spend several weeks observing their operation. At first, they were suspicious of his motives. Too many visitors had come seeking to exploit or expose them, rather than understand them. But Dr. Wright proved to be genuinely interested in learning about their successful collaboration and the practical aspects of their ranching operation. He interviewed each partner extensively, observed their daily routines, and asked thoughtful questions about the challenges and rewards of their arrangement. His presence also provided an opportunity for them to tell their story to someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding, rather than judging. "What you've built here is remarkable," Dr. Wright told them during his final week. "You've created a successful business while solving complex social and personal challenges. But more than that, you've demonstrated that people from different backgrounds can work together effectively when they focus on common goals rather than past conflicts." "Will you write about us in your book?" Luce asked. "With your permission, yes. I think your story could be important for people to hear. It shows that the frontier doesn't have to be about conflict and displacement. It can also be about cooperation and mutual benefit." Dr. Wright's book, published 2 years later, included a chapter about their ranch that painted a respectful and accurate picture of their partnership. The book gained some national attention, and their story was reprinted in several newspapers across the country. The publicity brought both positive and negative attention. They received letters from other frontier families facing similar challenges, and several people visited seeking advice about cross-cultural cooperation. But they also faced increased scrutiny from territorial authorities and hostility from some neighbors who disapproved of the attention their irregular arrangement was receiving. The most serious challenge came in their 5th year together when territorial officials, under pressure from some influential ranchers who resented their success, attempted to challenge their partnership on legal grounds. A lawyer from Santa Fe arrived with documents claiming that their business arrangement violated territorial regulations about Indian residency and land ownership. This crisis forced them to make a difficult decision about their future. They could fight the legal challenge, which would be expensive and time-consuming, or they could restructure their arrangement to satisfy the authorities. After long discussions, they chose a third option. Thomas would legally adopt Elena, Maria, and Luce as his sisters, making them full family members rather than business partners. This legal fiction satisfied the territorial requirements while preserving their actual relationship and business arrangement. The adoption ceremony, conducted by a sympathetic judge in Socorro, was both solemn and joyful. They understood that the legal paperwork was largely symbolic, but it also represented something deeper: their transformation from strangers thrown together by circumstances into a real family bound by choice and mutual respect. "I never expected to gain 3 sisters when I bought this land," Thomas said during the simple celebration dinner that followed the ceremony. "But I can't imagine a better outcome." Elena raised her coffee cup in a toast. "To family," she said simply. "Both born and chosen." Their 6th year together brought the ultimate test of their partnership's success. A severe drought struck the region, devastating many ranches and forcing numerous homesteaders to abandon their claims. Their valley, with its reliable stream and careful water management, fared better than most properties, but even they faced serious challenges. Working together, they implemented water conservation measures, moved cattle to areas where grass was still available, and helped struggling neighbors when they could. Their reputation for integrity and capability meant that several desperate ranchers approached them for help, and they were able to purchase cattle from failing operations at fair prices while helping their neighbors avoid complete ruin. By the time the drought ended, they had not only survived, but had actually expanded their operation significantly. More importantly, they had earned the respect and gratitude of neighbors who had initially been suspicious of their unconventional arrangement. "People care less about who you are when they need your help," Maria observed as they watched a neighbor's cattle drinking from their stream during the worst of the drought. "And they remember who helped them when times were hard." The years that followed brought steady growth and increasing prosperity. Their cattle operation became one of the most successful in the region. Their horse breeding program developed an excellent reputation, and they diversified into other activities, including a small trading post that served the scattered homesteads in the surrounding mountains. More personally, each of the partners found fulfillment and happiness that had seemed impossible during their difficult early years. Thomas had built something that lasted, something that was based on mutual respect and shared effort rather than domination or exploitation. Elena had found security and purpose for herself and her daughters, along with a place where they could be both Apache and American without having to choose sides. Maria had developed into a skilled rancher and businesswoman, respected by colleagues regardless of her gender or heritage. Luz had discovered talents she never knew she possessed and had built a life that honored her father's dream of cooperation between different peoples. On a warm autumn evening in their 10th year together, they sat on the porch of the expanded homestead watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in brilliant colors. The valley below was dotted with their cattle. The buildings were solid and well-maintained, and smoke rose peacefully from the chimneys of their neighbors' homes in the distance. "Thomas," Elena said quietly, "do you ever regret buying this land for $50? Thomas smiled, thinking back to that nervous young cowboy who had ridden into the valley with nothing but determination and a legal claim to some remote acreage. "Best $50 I ever spent," he said, though I had no idea what I was really buying at the time. "What do you think you were buying?" Luce asked with a grin. "I thought I was buying land to build a cattle ranch," Thomas replied. "What I actually bought was a chance to build something much more valuable. A family and a life that none of us could have created alone." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "My father always said that the best things in life are the ones you don't plan for. The ones that grow out of doing the right thing even when you don't know where it will lead." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they talked about their plans for the future. They would continue expanding their operation. They would help other families facing challenges similar to the ones they had overcome, and they would continue proving that cooperation could be more powerful than conflict. "You know what I think is the most important thing we've accomplished?" Elena said as they prepared to go inside for the night. "What's that?" Thomas asked. "We've shown that home isn't just about the land you own or the buildings you construct. It's about the people you choose to build a life with and the values you choose to build that life on." Thomas looked around at the homestead they had built together, at the family they had created through choice rather than blood, and at the life they had forged through mutual respect and shared effort. He thought about the scared young cowboy who had bought this land with everything he owned, and about 3 displaced Apache women who had found refuge in an abandoned cabin. None of them could have imagined, in those uncertain first days, how their accidental meeting would transform all of their lives. But as Thomas Mitchell looked around at everything they had accomplished together, he knew that Elena was absolutely right. They had built something far more valuable than a successful ranch. They had built a home in the truest sense of the word. The next morning would bring new challenges and new opportunities, as every day had for the past decade. But they would face them together as they had learned to face everything, with courage, wisdom, and the strength that comes from knowing you belong somewhere and with someone. For $50, a cowboy had purchased a homestead and discovered 3 Apache women living there. In the end, they all discovered that they had found something infinitely more precious than land or security. They had found their way home.